This is chapter 3, part 4. Let's continue on talking about trends in the 70s. Next point, organized crime groups in Europe. We see hard drugs coming from Europe at that time. They established this French connection depicted in a famous movie of that era, in which opium was grown in Turkey and then converted into heroin in southern French port cities, so via France, then smuggled into America, then sold on the streets of major cities. So during that period of time, United States, compared to much of the world, was a very wealthy country. People, young people, had the kind of money to spend for expensive drugs. And so again, you see these criminals stepping forward because they see a profit opportunity. So in this case, it's the origins are Europe and making its way to populations within the United States. A new form of crudely processed heroin came from Mexico, and this is known as black tar. It was beginning to be sold throughout the western United States, so we're talking California, West Coast, etc. Heroin abuse increased in many inner cities, so we see this sort of being concentrated in inner cities, again, kind of a largely urban phenomenon. And heroin abuse was later connected to the rise in the crime rate. Again, we're talking the 1970s here, specifically a growing number of robberies and burglaries committed by heroin abusers to get money to buy drugs. This is one of the main things that's driven drug policy in the United States too, is that what happens is when people get addicted to drugs, they become desperate. They become irrational, and they will commit crimes, not because they're normally criminals, but because they're driven to illegally obtain money to pay for their habit. All they care about is getting that next hit, getting drugs, and they're willing to commit robberies, burglaries, to get the money, to get the valuables, to be able to pay for more drugs. So it drives, in this sense, it drives the crime rate, and that concerns people and makes them want to get tough and crack down on crime because of the increase, and crack down on drugs because of the increase in crime that you see that goes along with the drugs. In 1968, President Richard Nixon declared, as when he was new president, declared a total war on drugs. As a matter of fact, he ran on a law and order, anti-drug sort of platform, and ordering his senior staff to make the reduction of drug abuse one of its top priorities. So late 60s, we're seeing a reaction to all of that sort of experimental drug use by young people. In 1970, the Nixon administration persuaded Congress to pass the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, popularly known as Controlled Substance Act, and abbreviated as a CSA. So this was a major piece of legislation here, major one in 1970. You begin to see the reaction against all of this drug use across the country and drug dealing. The act was passed to consolidate the large number of diverse and overlapping drug laws, as well as the duplication of efforts by several different federal agencies. So again, it's the effect basically is kind of putting more power in the hands of these small number of agencies in Washington, D.C. The act also established 5 schedules for the classification of drugs based upon their approved medical uses, potential for abuse, and potential for producing dependence. And one, I'm not going to get into it because I don't have time now, but one, again, an interesting part of this is that marijuana gets included with all these sort of more serious drugs and is looked upon as itself as being a serious drug, the way it gets classified starting with this act. The control of drugs was placed under the federal jurisdiction regardless of state regulations, which made it one of the most important drug control legislative acts in the nation's history. Looks like I've missed some part of that word there on history. And so indeed, this makes for national control, to control out of Washington, D.C., and the states, whatever the states want to do, subordinated to Washington, D.C. So this indeed is very important legislation. The 1970 Act also shifted the administration of federal drug enforcement from the Treasury to the Department of Justice. See, so here we make sort of official transition to the criminal justice system, and also creating the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA, putting it in charge of drug enforcement. within the Department of Justice, or subordinated to the Department of Justice. The DEA was given control of all drug enforcement responsibilities except those related to ports of entry and borders, which was given to the U.S. Customs Service, now renamed U.S. Customs and Border Protection. DEA agents were to conduct drug investigations, collect intelligence about general trends in drug trafficking and drug production, and coordinate efforts among federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. So again, these guys are at the top of the heap when it comes to drug enforcement. By the way, if folks, if any students are interested in federal jobs in the criminal justice system, everybody always thinks about FBI, but DEA is just a reminder that there are dozens of federal agencies that do a lot of the same sorts of activities that the FBI does, and might be a little less competitive to get a position in some of these other agencies compared to the FBI, which is very difficult to get a job there. So their mission today remains both domestic and foreign. Agents are stationed in foreign countries, so that's an interesting thing if you want to work in a foreign country, work for the DEA. And although they do not possess arrest powers in those countries, they act as liaisons with foreign law enforcement agencies. So that's just giving us a little flavor of what the DEA was tasked to do. Both the DEA and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, share responsibility for enforcement of the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, and the director of the DEA reports to the director of the FBI, who in 1982 was given responsibility for supervising all drug law enforcement efforts and policies. So again, FBI, Department of Justice, top of the heap. In the 1970s, the federal government estimated that 80% of heroin reaching the United States was produced from opium poppies grown in Turkey. So Turkey was the bad guys in the 1970s. But then that shifted, and we'll get into this later, that shifted in later years to Afghanistan as being a major producer of this. In an attempt to reduce the amount of heroin coming to the United States, the Nixon administration threatened to cut off aid to Turkey if that country did not put an end to the export of opium. Nixon also promised Turkey millions of dollars in aid to make up for the subsequent losses resulting from reduced poppy cultivation. So a lot of the drug policy issue has to do with dealing with other countries and sort of our policies with foreign affairs, with foreign international relationships. It's very much tied in with our relationships with other countries. Initially, this action did lead to a shortage of heroin on American streets in 1973. The decline in heroin availability, however, did not last long. In 1974, Mexico became a primary source of opium production, and in response, the U.S. government began to finance opium poppy eradication, or eliminating those poppies from Mexico. A demand reduction response of the Nixon administration to drug abuse, particularly with regard to the increase of heroin dependence, was to finance a number of treatment programs for drug-dependent individuals. So now we begin to see the first serious attempts to work on the demand element of this. I want drugs, and try to get to work with people to beat their addictions and to not want to use these drugs anymore. So Nixon administration was the first administration to begin to focus on treatment. These treatment programs range from in-person or inpatient detoxification and therapeutic communities to newly created methadone outpatient programs. We'll talk about all this later on down the road. By 1978, 11 states had criminalized small amounts of marijuana. So we see in the more liberal states throughout the country small moves to sort of treat less aggressively the possession of small amounts of marijuana. California and Oregon made possession of 1 ounce or less of marijuana a citable misdemeanor with a maximum penalty of $1,000, which certainly was a lot of money in 1978. And there were no increased penalties for repeat offenders. So at the time, these were less punitive, milder responses to possession of marijuana. So you see early signs of this softening approach to marijuana in some states back in the 70s, but it's only just the beginning. Relaxed attitudes toward drugs reached a peak in 1979, a year when an estimated 51% of high school seniors reported having smoked marijuana, and 28% reported using an illicit drug other than marijuana over the past 12 months, the latter being about twice the level reported in 2017. Okay, so what's important about these numbers? The main story here is that drug use among young people, teenagers, college students, whoever you're talking about, whatever population, it grew in the 60s and it continued to grow more in the 1970s, and it peaked in, say, 1979, 1980, when I was just a very young teenager. That was the peak of drug use, where more young people than ever were using marijuana or some sort of illegal drug, and that those numbers were significantly higher then than they are now. It's come down since then. That was, if you look at the charts, that was a peak period around 1980. Let's see. In the 1990s, concern grew about cocaine. Many celebrities were entering rehabilitation programs, and some died from cocaine overdoses. So it was kind of seen again in the very earliest stages, was seen as glamorous and something used at parties and is expensive and kind of quote unquote cool, right? Chic. But that's what you see in the early stages, and then you see people get addicted to it, and it messes them up, and then you see some people overdose, and oh my goodness, unnecessary death. And so by the time you get, and actually that's a typo, that should be 1980s, it shouldn't be 1990s. So by the 1980s, you saw all the fallout, all the negative consequences of powder cocaine, and you saw people reacting against it, and you see the celebrities going into rehab clinics and, you know, overdosing, and so people kind of started to think, wow, maybe this cocaine isn't such a good thing for people to be taking. And of course, it's highly, highly addictive, so it's one of those very serious type of drugs. But around 84, 85, you see the emergence of a cheap form of cocaine. Cocaine in the powder form is very expensive, but they developed, I don't know who exactly it was who developed this cheap crack form, hardened form of cocaine, which gave you a really intense high that didn't last long. It was a very short high, but very powerful and extremely addictive. But it was cheap enough, $5 or something like that, that you could get high for not much money. And so it really took off in poor, urban, especially black neighborhoods in the mid 80s, and really just devastated a lot of these inner city communities because it was cheap and so addictive that it just grabbed on to quite a few people during that period of time. And of course, a lot of these issues will come up again and again as we go throughout the semester. In the 1980s, grassroots groups began to demand that something be done about America's drug problem. Again, and the use peaked around 1980. So President Reagan, who just came in as a newly elected president, declared an all-out war on drugs. And First Lady Nancy Reagan launched her Just Say No campaign. So again, you see a movement across at the national level aggressively against the use of these drugs. Reagan's approach was to control the supply of drugs by increasing the budgets of drug enforcement agencies and providing foreign aid to such countries like Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Mexico that had a lot of cultivation and product, the producing, manufacture, and distribution of these illegal drugs, trying to give those folks money to help them crack down and try to stop the cultivation and production of these drugs like cocaine, like marijuana, etc., heroin. Demand was to be reduced by enacting laws that imposed some of the harshest penalties ever for drug law violators. So again, the thinking is a deterrence one. If you make the punishment painful enough, if the punishment is heavy and strict enough on people to convince them to stop selling, to stop manufacturing, to stop using these drugs. Congress virtually rewrote all of the nation's drug laws. In 1984, Congress passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which increased the penalties for violations of the Controlled Substance Act and expanded asset forfeiture laws, allowing both local and federal drug enforcement to keep most of the money made from the sale of assets. So the big picture here is more getting tough, using criminal justice to try to reduce the drug problem in the United States. Congress also passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which placed mandatory minimum sentences for federal drug convictions, eliminating a judge's discretion in pronouncing a sentence. So there was a perception that some judges were too soft on these crimes, and that if you impose a minimum sentence, mandatory, like you don't have a choice, they have to do at least this much time for a given crime, then the idea was that it takes the hands out of judges. And also some people were worried about judges being biased. And so if you have a mandatory law, then it takes the authority out of the judge's hands, and if they're biased, then it eliminates that. A mandatory sentence could not be suspended, nor could the offender be paroled or placed on probation. So again, it's get tough policies. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 also created a kingpin statute, kingpin meaning the drug lord, the drug leader, the leader of the drug syndicate or gang statute, in which the heads of drug trafficking organizations could receive mandatory life imprisonment if convicted of operating a continuing criminal enterprise. So in particular, the aggressiveness was toward the drug dealer, as we often see the trafficker, or the leader, a recurring pattern. Okay, let's continue on in the next segment.